We're going to start the program a little early. Please enjoy your meals and eat quietly, please, so we can start this program. I welcome all of you. I'm the person that had to fill the big shoes. I succeeded John Brandl as dean here. His name is Brian Atwood, for those of you who don't know me, and most of you do. Thank you so much, John. And you know, the kind of welcome he just gave me is the kind of welcome I got 6 years ago when I first arrived here, and I have appreciated it ever since. Every time I looked for advice from John Brandl, I got the best possible advice in the world, and he's just a thoroughly honorable gentleman, and I thank him. I would like to introduce everyone in this audience because you're all special. You're all here because you're close friends of John's, you're students of John's, your faculty that worked with him, your former legislators. There are a couple of people that I always pay deference to. One is Vice President Fritz Mondale. Is he still here? There he is. I pay deference to him because I strongly suspect if it hadn't been for his secret support, I might not be here today. Known him for many years. And I also pay deference to my boss, the provost of the University of Minnesota, Tom Sullivan. So, I'd like to ask John's family, Shelley, and everyone who's a member of the Brandl family, even the extended family, to please stand up and be recognized tonight. People that you saw standing here have always been John Brandl's first priority, I can assure you, despite the fact that he's had such a distinguished career in so many different ways. And you have on your seats a very short synopsis of John Brandl's career, and it is rather remarkable. Obviously, a PhD degree from Harvard University and all of those academic credentials, John, that I wish I had. The fact that he has served on the faculties of several universities, very prominent universities. The fact, as most people know here, he has served in the federal government in 3 different capacities. He was actually once one of those McNamara whiz kids in the Defense Department, and worked for the Office of Economic Opportunity, and worked at the old HEW, the Health, Education, Welfare Department, as a Deputy Assistant Secretary. What is amazing to me, frankly, is to understand that he spent those good years in Washington and in Cambridge and still has contributed so much to Minnesota and to Minnesota's society, as Laurie Sturtevant wrote so well on Sunday. He's a person that is just so representative of what I have come to learn this state is all about. And you should all feel so very proud of him. And of course, we at the Humphrey Institute feel doubly proud that he spent his career here, including as dean. He felt after several years of being a professor that he had to take a demotion and serve as dean for a few years. But he did that job extraordinarily well, and as I said before, not only did he welcome me, but he left me with resources, and he left me with a self-study plan that we have used to build this Humphrey Institute. You can look at a person's career and read a resume, and it still doesn't really speak to what the man is. And tonight we're going to hear from several people who know him well from various incarnations in his life. But I just want to say one thing about John. I have spent a career working in international relations, and I started as an exchange student and learned a lot about intercultural understanding and exchanges, and have come to the conclusion, as we look at a number of religious wars going on around the world, that if everyone actually lived their religion, whether they were Christian, Jew, Muslim, Buddhist, or whatever, that this world would be a peaceful place, no matter what religion. And John Brandl happens to be a Christian who has absolutely lived his religion. His politics reflect his religion. His positions on policy issues reflect his religion. And yesterday, I was in church myself, do that often, and we got to the final hymn that was sung, and my daughter fortunately had a pad of paper and a pen, and I decided I had to write down the words to this final hymn because in my view that was John Brandl, that was what he's all about. I'll read you those words and just think about John Brandl and what you know of him and tell me whether or not this isn't accurate. The hymn was called, "We Are Called," and these are the words. We are called to act with justice. We are called to love tenderly. We are called to serve one another, to walk humbly with God. And I believe that is what makes John Brandl so special. It isn't because he was in one political party or the other, and there are many people here, by the way, of the other political party who absolutely love and admire him. It isn't because he has one particular ideology or one particular position on education, and there are certainly probably plenty of people here who disagree with him on some of those issues. It's because of the very special person he is, because he has actually lived his religion. I want to announce tonight, there are very few prerogatives that a dean has, but I'm going to just simply assume this one. Henceforth, the Dean's Conference Room will be called the John Brandl Conference Room at the Humphrey Institute. So John, we will be reminded every day we go in there to battle out the issues of the day of the Humphrey Institute, always be thinking that what would John Brandl do when we walk through those doors? So now I'd like to introduce people from different phases, again, of John's life. He's would, I'm sure, like to hear everyone reflect on their relationship with him, but we can't do that, and we've got 10 speakers, and I promised to be brief tonight, and I haven't been, but all of them have promised to be very brief. And the first, in fact, I've got something to pull them off the stage, because in the end we want to hear from Shelley and John as well. The first speaker is a colleague of John's for more than 30 years. He is a professor at the Humphrey Institute. They were both economists and Harvard graduates, and their friendship started very early. He's Professor Bob Kudeley.
Thank you, Brian. When I was honored to be asked to speak about John tonight on behalf of his Humphrey Institute colleagues, I sent out a note asking for advice. I wish I had 50 minutes or an hour or longer to share with you what I learned, but unfortunately I only have 5 minutes. A couple of my newer colleagues wrote that although they didn't know John at all well, he had really made them feel at home as new faculty, and that he always treated them and their opinions with the utmost respect. Those reactions took me back to the summer of 1972, when John and Shelley greeted Venetia and me as we arrived at the School of Public Affairs, an outfit that had only been going for 3 or 4 years at that time. John designed and he ran that institution for 7 years. His initial sole collaborator, Jim Jernberg, who's with us here tonight, told me that from the very beginning, although they both joked about how trite it might sound, John always aimed to do the right thing. And this was a career-long concern that was confirmed by many other colleagues. Like those new colleagues that I mentioned, many people, especially students who so much admired John's fine teaching, used the word respectful when they talked about John's behavior. I know that that comes from deep inside. John makes people feel respected because he really respects them. And this was a great asset for him, both at the university and at the legislature. One person remembered something John said many years ago. You have to hear people's good intentions. Most people want to do the right thing. In what was probably a unique occurrence in American higher education, John came back to lead the institution that he built 20 years after he first stepped down. He came to oversee a place that had certainly succeeded, but it had grown and changed in ways that would have seemed pure fantasy in 1969 when he came. Quite understandably, for many people across this country, particularly those connected with the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management, which John helped build and later led, John Brandl continues to personify public affairs education at Minnesota. John wanted his faculty to have 1 foot in the academy and 1 foot outside. And he's led by example. He came to the university, as Brian mentioned, from an important position evaluating educational policy for the federal government. And in fact, the improvement of education at all levels has been his greatest single policy interest, both academically and in his work as a long-serving state legislator. As many of you know, he promoted new approaches to educational choice, also examined the uses of competitive mechanisms as well as community action, not just in education, but for public services more broadly. He did this in a fine book for the Brookings Institution, published a number of years ago, and also in the lucid and persuasive newspaper pieces that my colleagues and I so much admire. There were huge payoffs for both the university and the legislature from John's service at both. And John always stressed how the two provided balance in his professional life. He liked to point out that when he got completely fed up with horse trading, bickering, backstabbing, and generally unprincipled behavior, he simply jumped in his car and drove over to St. Paul. I never knew how much he was joking when he said that. Over about 36 years, I've had countless conversations with John Brandl, but one will always stay with me. I came to John's office in the late autumn, in the afternoon. Steeply slanted sunlight doppling the office. It's very, very peaceful. We began talking about some technical problem in economics. We taught together for many years in the policy analysis sequence here, which some of you have actually suffered through. You suffered through my part. You enjoyed John's part. The conversation soon turned away from technical issues to larger issues, and ultimately to nothing less than the central purpose of public policy. Now, economists know that people don't live by bread alone, but they usually keep that insight to themselves. In fact, they are professionally inclined to construe the whole society as a kind of giant bakery. But John Brandl is not that kind of economist. He can never be accused of that. And the upshot of our conversation was that the most important goal of public policy should be to support the aspirations of ordinary people to forge lives of meaning and dignity for themselves and for their families. Now, that leaves a lot to consider, of course, but doing the right thing simply isn't possible without a larger vision. And then I realized that many of John's very difficult decisions over the years, and there were a lot of them, could be traced back to this single idea. I talked with John at the Humphrey Institute graduation a few weeks ago. He was resplendent, as always, in his crimson Harvard PhD gown, and he was in very good spirits, but he wasn't in good health. He was tired, and he was eager for the proceedings to be over, but not so he could go home. He was taking his grandson fishing on Lake Calhoun. Absolutely the right thing to do. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Gail Zoffer, who is a former advisee of John's from the early 1990s. Gail?
In his book, The Courage to Teach, Parker Palmer suggests that good teachers weave a complex web of connections among their subjects, their students, and themselves, so that students can learn to weave a world for themselves. In Palmer's words, the connections made by good teachers are not held in their methods, but in their hearts. John Brandl's capacity for connectedness is part of what made him such a memorable teacher and advisor, not only in the years I spent at the Humphrey Institute, but also in the years since. John not only connects with warmth, respect, and curiosity with individual students, but also connects students with his passion for public service and for public policy that is informed not only by good information and sound analytic tools, but also by humane values. In the words of one of my classmates, from whom I also sought advice, Dan Donkers, John brought a true commitment to public life into the classroom and an honest desire to bring students into honorable roles in their own public lives. He sparked their creativity in analyzing questions of what is meant by the public good and how it could be realized or lost in the political realm. His respect for students is authentic, his desire for learning genuine. While grounded in economic theory, he tempered its tendency toward a certain coldness with a healthy dose of ethical questioning. I first encountered John as a teacher in my initial semester at the Institute when he was co-teaching Policy Analysis 1 with Professor Cooterly, a core course for all master's level students. And while I may remember few of the details of cost-benefit analysis, the way John asked and answered questions sticks with me still. There was nothing formulaic or dogmatic in his answers to student questions. He would pause, ponder, and respond thoughtfully to the heart of the question, willing to engage freshly with the material and with the student. When I wanted the chance to think in greater depth about an emerging passion for educational policy, John agreed to serve as my advisor for an independent study on that subject. He'd reach under his desk into his mini refrigerator and share a Diet Coke with me before we began our wide-ranging conversations. As you might expect, the subject of publicly funded voucher programs for low-income students made its way onto our agenda. John's strongly held convictions and rich knowledge and experience were matched by a genuine desire to understand my questions and my perspectives. One of the things I remember most from those conversations was musing about how our respective Catholic and Jewish heritages influenced our viewpoints on public education and various voucher proposals. For with John, the consideration of where we ought to head as individuals or as a state is not removed from the consideration of who we are. That interplay between the personal and the intellectual has also been a hallmark of the lunches John and I have shared in the years after graduation. We were as likely to discuss how his life had been enriched by the decision to care for his grandson one day a week as we were to debate current issues facing the state legislature. And in those conversations, John has always offered the same accessibility, generosity, and curiosity I had prized as his student. We teach who we are, and I could have had no finer teacher in the art of living or policymaking than John Brandl.
Our next speaker is Dan Whalen, who happens to be a member of the Humphrey Institute Advisory Council. He's a former student of John's and a great admirer, and he has been instrumental in establishing an endowed scholarship in John's name for those interested in public service. Dan? I'm not sure if you need this, but we need to probably get this back up. There we go. Okay. You don't need it.
Probably need this up. I got the message that I had 34 minutes. Is that right? I guess it was 3 or 4. On the way here, I live in Oakland, California, and I stopped at the medical center on the way over to have a little procedure myself because my bladder is connected to my tear ducts, and I had to have it snipped in order to do this. I've known John since 1970, and I heard about him a couple of years before that. I want to say, I guess, 3 things if I got time. First, I want to tell you all the things that I've got in common with John, because I want to link myself with this great man, and that's what I understand great politicians are supposed to do, look like somebody else. And then I want to talk a little bit about what I learned from you, John, and then if I have, unless the Gong Show host here pulls me off, I want to tell my wife's favorite story about you. Well, here are the things I have in common with this great man. We both lived in St. Cloud. We were both educated by Benedictine teachers. John, elementary school, high school, and university. And me, high school and university. We both graduated from St. John's University. I was associated with the Department of Defense also. I was in Reserve Officer Training Corps for 1 semester. I also worked at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare as an intern at the Administration on Aging. I also knew Ellen Enthoven, who was John's boss at the Department of Defense when he was one of these whiz kid guys. I was a student of Ellen Enthoven's. And then probably most importantly, John and I both met my future wife at the same time at his house. Now, so where is Jim Jernberg? Jim would probably say at this point, I know John Brandl. John Brandl is a friend of mine, and you are no John Brandl. Now, here's what I learned from you. one of the things I learned, you're the first one to tell me this, that for me, perfection is the enemy of the good. And that it's better to choose successive improvements than to wait around for the perfect solution. Now, you never put it quite this way, but I did learn from you that facts are friendly. Use them to guide choices. And I also remember learning about the power of cost-benefit analysis. And again, I don't know that you'd put it quite this way, but the way I remember it is, go where the greatest net benefit leads you. And of course, do the right thing. Now, for Catherine Conroy Whalen's favorite story. We were both students here, actually at the Social Science Tower, and she was taking a final exam in policy analysis or something from John, and she sat down in the exam room, opened her blue book, looked at all the test questions, read them carefully, froze like a deer in headlights, couldn't think of a thing, closed her blue book, and walked tearfully out of the room into the hallway, where she met John Brandl, who said, "Casey, what's the problem?" She told him, and he said, "Don't worry, we'll work this out." And then he gave her a big hug, which, of course, he could no longer do today. Well, she sends her love, and you have mine as well. Thank you, John.
Our next speaker is the former Speaker of the House of Representatives in Minnesota and a former colleague of John's, worked with him on education issues, and she's now the president of a community college here, Ann Winia.
Thank you, Brian. Honesty compels me to disclose that I'm not a former speaker. I'm only a majority leader. But anyway, most importantly, I am a colleague of John Brandl's. It is January 3rd of 1977, and the newly elected members of the Minnesota House of Representatives have assembled to conduct momentous business. First, the oath of office, then the election of the Speaker, our most important decision we'll ever make, the temporary rules, and then, for me, the most important decision, selecting my seat on the House floor. I chose the seat next to John Brandl, and that has made all the difference. We legislators spend hundreds of hours in those seats, and what I got was a personal tutorial from John Brandl on economics, politics, Minnesota, specifically central Minnesota, people, fishing, elections, and most importantly, life. I still recite Brandl maxims. Just because someone does you harm doesn't necessarily mean they're out to get you. No situation is irretrievable. Adrenaline addiction disorder. Those are all from John. So I can't talk about John Brandl's legislative career without talking about the impact that he had on so many of his colleagues. He's a thoughtful man, tremendous experience, and he spoke of powerful ideas and principles, but more importantly, he spoke to be understood. And perhaps that is why, when either representative or senator Brandl spoke, others stopped to listen and to think about what he said. One of our colleagues, Representative Valinga, tells me it got her in no end of trouble because she would find she agreed with John after she listened to him. And then she would have trouble with her endorsements and her elections. But you know, that was the power that John had, the power of ideas. He didn't reduce issues to a slogan. Instead, he probed deep, and he thought complicated thoughts, and all of us learned from John. Senate Majority Leader Mo told me, "I never knew how John would vote." But as some of you know, I always knew how John would vote, and I frequently voted for him. It was permissible in those days when a member was absent from the floor to vote for them. And John loves to tell the story about the time he rushed into the floor and he noticed that I was voting green, he was voting red. He thought I had somehow punched the wrong button. He got the clerk's attention, he changed his vote, only to discover he was really against that bill. Now, I decided to do some research on John and his legislative career, a little empirical research. So I looked into all the bills that he had authored. And frankly, I was looking for some dirt here. I was hoping to discover that among his accomplishments would be a stadium bill or a mega mall or big tax subsidies to some corporation, maybe a bill to make milk the state drink or blueberry the state muffin. I couldn't find a thing. Nothing out of sync with the Brandl that we all know and admire. What instead I found were legislation to provide services to the disabled, to ensure the economic and health support of Minnesota's children, to raise the ethical standards for public officials, to expand educational opportunities, to improve the delivery of services, to end discrimination. You get the idea. But there were a few tax bills in the group. But John Brandl applied his copious talents as a legislator to representing a group of people who couldn't afford fancy lobbyists, who never had time to take off work and go down to the Capitol, but whose lives were directly affected by the decisions that government makes and the services that government delivers. John Brandl has always stood up for them, and that has made all the difference. Thank you, John.
George Latimer asked me to be brief. The former mayor of St. Paul, George Latimer.
Didn't have to be that brief. I wondered about this idea when I was called, but listening to these stories and perspectives and deepening my love and understanding of John Brandl has made this whole meal worthwhile. I'll take one exception to what Brian Atwood said. You remember, he said, there are people in the other party who love him too. Well, I know why the people in the other party loved John too. It is because they could count on him driving us Democrats crazy. And he did it successfully for so many years. It's an academic setting we have, so I ask you a thoughtful question. What happens if you clone a Benedictine nun, I take that back, Benedictine monk, with Milton Friedman? Any Democrat who understood what would happen would understand John Brandl. My memory of him, even though we're good friends, will always be what's been referred to all night. He's a teacher. He's a great teacher. When I was at the Shanghai Conservatory of Music, they have little stalls where the violinist is playing and the teacher is looking straight at the violinist and listening to the violinist. And you could tell there was learning going on. When I came here to visit John one day, and he was meeting with a graduate student, and the graduate student and he, their eyes were locked, and John was listening, and you could just feel that going on. He was a great teacher. And if I can be personal just for a moment, Nancy Moore Latimer came here before it was called the Humphrey Institute and studied under John, and she knew a lot about early childhood education before she came here. But when she was here, and she went through all the algebraic tables and all the rest, she then would start talking to me about cost-benefit analysis. I said, what's that got to do with it? Just do it. It sounds like a good idea. She said, it depends on what the outcomes are. So with that kind of burden that Brandl placed on our household for 20 years, I had to come to grips with the idea that what you put in isn't as important as what comes out of it. I still haven't got that entirely straight. John has always been our teacher, and he always will be. But this has been touched upon many times as well. And he couldn't have been that great of a teacher. One of his students walking in here with me said, you always felt that John learned from the students as well. And a great teacher can tolerate silence. You know what the silence, most profound silence is? When a student asks a question and the teacher, John Brandl, will be silent just for that moment. You've all been in the presence of a great teacher who actually listens to what the student was asking, becomes part of what went into that question before answering. John even does that after a cocktail or two. This is the kind of kindness he has. Now, the kindness had limits. There was one time, and you all know how kind the man is, there was one time someone, I'm sure it wasn't a faculty member, it was a faculty member, who got him so angry that he said, I said, what'd you do? He said, I threw him out of my office. Now the mind boggles to think of what anyone could do to make this good, kind, and generous friend do that. You've never done it to me, and thank God for that. And thank God for you, John.
Our next speaker is Lori Sturdivant, and of course, those of you who read the Star Tribune know that she writes intelligently every week, and it's a delight to have you here, Lori.
Well, thank you, Brian, and Julie and Jamie, whoever had me go after George Latimer, not nice. We'll talk about this later, not nice. But good to be with all of you. Tonight I'm going to, despite the fact that I'm with all these august people from whom we've tried to keep this secret for so many years, we're going to draw back the curtain tonight on what happens in the inner sanctum at the Star Tribune editorial board. Those secret private meetings where somebody comes in and kind of grumpily says, gee, we probably should do something this Sunday on the state budget deficit. Gee, we haven't done anything for a long time on the achievement gap in education. Gee, what about what they're saying now in Washington or in St. Paul about welfare or about defense or about all kinds of things? Who can we get to write for us? Who can we ask so we don't have to do the work ourselves? Who can we get that would be credible, that would actually know something, that would be a bit unpredictable, not in the pocket of a particular interest group or known to be a partisan of either the extreme left or the right? Who could we get to write? And the name would always come up, John Brandl. And then there would be the question, who's going to call him and ask him to write? Or should one of us go over and interview him? And I would volunteer for that assignment. That would be more fun than simply calling him up. But you know, so many times after such conversations, sometimes there'd be a little time that would elapse before the appointment was made or the call was placed, but something would show up in the Star Tribune's in bucket. Those emails would come carrying an unsolicited but perfectly written, just to the T opinion piece from John Brandl. John, I meant to go back today and count how many bylines on the Star Tribune page you have, and I apologize, I didn't get that count done, but I asked Bob White, my old boss, what would be his guess, and he said, you know, for a while there in the 1980s, John was a regular contributor. John was writing for our pages, sharing his wisdom. This is at a time when he was a legislator, was in the thick of debates at the Capitol, was also continuing his responsibilities at this institution, was involved in so many ways in the community, but still took the time to write for the Star Tribune and share what he knew and share his perspective with the much larger audience that is the Star Tribune readership. I think that's what they had in mind when they talked about a land-grant institution and about sharing the knowledge of this place. I think that's what the founders of this institution had in mind when they chose the name Hubert Humphrey and remembered his career as a professor politician, just like John. So I appreciated very much this bio sheet that was passed out, and I don't know that it really made mention much of his Star Tribune career, so I would like you to just do a little editing and amend this. It says educator, legislator, and civic leader. I'd like you to add the words opinion journalist. And I claim that phrase for myself. I'd like to claim that for you as well, John, and I'm honored to claim you as my colleague. And I feel privileged to call you my friend. Thank you.
Next speaker is a longtime personal friend of John's, a graduate of the Humphrey Institute. He's worked as a policy consultant and healthcare and business executive for many years, Ed Dirkswager.
Thank you very much, Brian. I've known John all my life. We grew up together in St. Cloud, went to the same schools. He went to graduate school at Harvard, and I was at a competitive institution in New Haven. We lived in Washington, D.C. when he worked for Allen Einthoven. And when they came back here, we were already here. And so we've lived in close proximity, and I've had the privilege of knowing him all my life. And next to Diane, my wife, he's my best friend. You know, it's really rare to have the good fortune to grow up with someone and you have personal, educational, intellectual, and professional interests intersect in such a way that we have studied together, worked together, played, prayed, grieved, and supported each other throughout all of our lives. John's always been there for me when I needed him, and that's been plenty often. And Diane and I are proud that John and Shelley met in Diane's folks' living room when we were in college. I've got some stories I could tell about that, but Diane edited everything I wrote. So Diane and Shelley were classmates, and that's how she met Shelley. And I can't number the times when John and I met, and we've met very, very often on a personal and professional basis throughout our lives. And I can't count the times when he said how lucky he was to have married Shelley. All this goes by way of saying that I'm hardly an impartial observer in speaking about the man, his career, and his accomplishments. It's already been pointed out, and more will come later, that John's immediate and his extended family has always been one of the fonts from which he has drawn nourishment and one of his highest priorities, or his highest priority, not one of them. He's grounded in his family, and he's grounded in Minnesota. He often talks about the necessity for all of us to spend the time and energy that's necessary to nurture friendships and family. And many of us, especially people of our generation, when our kids were young, regret that we didn't spend as much time with them as we now feel we might have. At least that is in my case. And but that gave me at least an understanding of how important it is, and in John's conversations with me, he has reinforced that. And this is another area in which John has taken his own advice, and the proof is in the results, and the results speak for themselves in terms of the family. But what impresses me most about John, and always has, is his character. There are some things that have been commented on tonight and that we all know about him. He's a very positive disposition, great integrity. He's a very private man, a caring person who can keep a confidence. He's value-driven and loves a good debate. Sister Ann Rose helped him learn that quite a few years ago. He isn't afraid to champion a cause that isn't popular. And I've always envied John's balance and the fact that he really does, as has been pointed out, listen to other people and tries to understand all sides of an argument, and that he is intellectually honest in doing so. It has always been so much fun to discuss issues with him because he listens, he challenges, and only then he tries to get you to understand his point of view. A central characteristic of his life is to use his intellect, education, and ability to innovate, his positions of influence, his stubbornness, and energy to improve the common good. John places a higher value on ideas and implementation of ideas. Both of those things are important to him than on money and things. John himself has had ideas that have substantial bearing on public affairs. For example, the idea that, from my perspective, forms a seminal and foundation public policy theory can be found in his book, already spoken of, Money and Good Intentions Are Not Enough. And then he also wrote an article in the book he edited when he left the deanship, in the book Common Good, Ideas from the Humphrey. His idea, the essence of which I hope not to butcher in describing it, is that to create government-funded programs that operate satisfactorily, we must harness the power of markets and community. We must understand that money and good intentions are not enough, and we must be aware and take account of the knight and knave that's in each of us. In creating this idea or theory, he has synthesized various life experiences and education and life lessons. In a very real sense, it's autobiographical, and it would be fun for me, and I'm not going to do it, to trace all of this from his upbringing in St. Cloud, his family, to the Benedictines, to Father Martin, and beyond. Suffice it to say that in watching this idea grow and blossom, I, for one, have found it a thing of beauty. In closing, I must reflect on the fact that a significant part of each of us is shaped by the company we keep. And the intimate relationships we have contribute to the core of who we are. We become and remain part of each other. Thanks, John, for being my friend, and thank you for your role in making me the person that I am.
John Cairns is another friend of John's who shares his interest in education reform. John is a founding member of Public Schools Incentives, a nonprofit organization that funds school reform and restructuring in Minnesota. John.
Thank you, Brad. Good evening. It's no surprise to me, but I think I could have taken pieces of what everybody else has said and simply shuffled them, reshuffled them, and put it down for what I'd like to say about John, which is, of course, a tribute to the fact that John is John consistently and almost always in a thoughtful way with all of you and all of us that know him so well. I first met John in the mid-'70s. It was a good marriage of a left-wing Republican, yes, there were that species did exist in those days, with a rather wise and sensible Democrat who quickly pointed out that I really didn't always know what I was talking about, which is no surprise to any of you who've worked with him over the years. In fact, it's been said of John, you're hard to argue with because you know all the facts and all the rest of us can do is sling it, which I've run across with John more than once. I think early on, we not only connected well and on thinking about public policy, but the groundwork was set for the many years since, which is John and I think about public policy in terms of outcomes, not inputs. That is, what has really happened because government did something? And that discipline John has shared with so many people so many times. In fact, one of my favorite things to do over these years was every time I heard of a young person who actually wanted to run for public office, less so than it should be the case, my first thought was, let's go talk to John, because I want them to understand from John what it means to be a public person, what it means to be in public office, and how you get there. You don't get there by doing all the mechanics of campaigning. You get there by understanding what public policy is and by, as you've all heard, doing the right thing. That's what makes public policy work, and that's what made John work so well in all these years. And in particular, I can think of any number of younger politicians who've, over the years, emerged as strong governing people, Steve Kramer and Paul Thiessen among them, but there's many others. And I think, of course, John's talked to hundreds of legislators over the years. Most listen to him, maybe not most, but in fact, probably too few, really, when you get right down to it. But he's been a marvelous teacher for people who've been in public office and public life. For the last 15 years, John and Shelley, or 15 years plus, we've had a little Sunday night salon group of 6, 7 couples who get together, Kaplans, Shapiros, Latimers, Karens, Hegards, Brandls, and we kind of go at each other about public policy issues. And we go at each other hard, and back and forth, back and forth. Of course, we're always kind of moving around the center because the rest of us are kind of bouncing off the wall all the time. John's just kind of rock solid right in the middle and tries to remind us to bring us back to kind of, let's talk about a real issue, a real solution, a real result. And we can tell anecdotes over and over again about this. I'll tell you only one, which John and I have always enjoyed thinking about. But at one night in the heat of a very tough debate about something or the healthcare policy, I think, John and I were, of course, holding down the rational center of the debate while the rest of our friends were bouncing off walls all over the place with single payer this and single payer that. And as they were going along, John and I were sitting and listening to the debate carrying on, and a person in our group who I won't name turns to us and says, well, what do Dumb and Dumber think? And that became the way I introduced myself to John by phone for many, many years, for our racquetball games and whatever else. This is Dumb, hi Dumber, how are you? Seemed like a very good fit. Anyway, Salon was a lot of fun, and there are many other stories, but it was a great time for all of us who've been in it. And I've always said, of course, George, that Nan was the heart. And John is probably the conscience of our group. He will always be. Excuse me. You know, I was trying to think about one word that might fit as I wrote these comments and thought about it tonight. And I ended up on the word enlightened. And what I think is, John, you are, and all of us who get to converse with you become more so. And thanks for being part of my life.
Thank you, John. Our final speaker, before we hear from John Brandl and Shelley, is John's brother, Gene, who has a story he wants to tell us that illustrates John's friendship and generosity. Gene?
They told me I had to write down what I was going to say, not because I'd forget. I think both John and I inherited an ability from our father to make a short story long. Those of you who've gotten beyond seeing John as remarkable and wonder how he could be both theoretical and philosophical and still be such a good teacher and so humane, I have two insights for you: expectations and kindness. Expectations. There are two ways that John used expectations. He expects the best from people. He appeals to the best in people. And they usually rise to the occasion. And then as a teacher, he has a neat trick. He sells his audience. He sells them first. So they expect good things, and then he rises to the occasion. I've had a unique and ongoing perspective of John. You see, I was one of his first students growing up. Project might be a better term. And he gave me the tools to observe him. One of the first things that he taught me was pay attention. Sounds simple, but it's amazing how much you can learn if you just pay attention. Now, you don't get people to pay attention by saying, "Hey, you, pay attention." That lasts about as long as the echo of your words. You get people to pay attention by creating the expectation that that's what they're doing. He never told me what I experienced, but he never forgot to ask me what I experienced. So he expected me to know what was going on with me, and I thought he might ask, so I paid attention. And I got in the habit of doing that. One of the things that he taught me to pay attention to was teachers. From the excellent ones like John to the lousy ones. And I built a scale so that I'd know which ones I ought to pay attention to. From the lousy ones to the excellent ones like John. And I'd like to tell you what that scale looks like. On this end, I want you to picture a guy with a pitchfork standing in the back of a manure wagon. I think we've all been on the receiving end of those kind of lectures. In the middle of the scale are the teachers who actually know what they're talking about. What a novel idea. The good teachers start up here, and they're the ones that not only do they know what they're talking about, but they actually believe it. And the best ones are the ones that know what they're talking about, who believe it, and get their students to want to listen. You know, think of yourself in front of a group. Would you rather talk to a group of exhaust fans who are blowing at you? Or would you rather talk to a group of human vacuum cleaners who are ready to suck up everything that you have to sell? And John did it with expectations. He got you to really want what he had to sell. That's how he did it with me starting in grade school. He got me to want to know fractions and negative numbers and algebra. His cell goes like this. This is really a handy tool. You need to know this. It'll be very useful for you. You'll be glad you have this. The first time he did this was when he was 12 and I was 6. He had the Pioneer Press franchise for the St. Cloud Hospital, which meant going room to room selling newspapers every morning. And he taught me this really neat tool. It was called making change. So he could cover half of the rooms and I would cover the other half of the rooms. Come to think of it, I don't remember getting half of the profits. Is that why you waited a few years to teach me fractions? But I got paid in other ways. Like the day when I was 6 and we were walking from the hospital to our grade school. And as we passed by Wilson School, you taught me how to whistle songs. What a wonderful lifetime gift. And it's also a nice segue into John's history of kindness. This started very early. Many of you know that John is an accomplished piano player. Well, from the time I was 5 until I was 10, my bedtime coincided with the time that John practiced his piano. And I had a bedtime ritual. I would run upstairs, put on my pajamas, brush my teeth, come downstairs, and give you the list of my favorite music. Falling Waters was the best. And then I'd run upstairs, jump under the covers, and fall asleep listening to my favorite music. I'd like you to just think of this. In your early development years, the contentment and sense of well-being that came from 5 years of going to bed almost every night, listening to your brother play your favorite songs. I thank you for your gifts of expectation and kindness, and I want you to know I'm still paying attention.
Thank you so much, Gina. As you were speaking, I was watching John's face. I think some of the things you said were revelations to him in terms of his influence over you. Now it is such a great pleasure and honor to invite our guest of honor to come to the stage. Great John Brandl. Please give him a hand.
Well, it's too bad our parents weren't here to listen to this. Dad would have enjoyed hearing all of that, and Mom would have believed some of it. Thank you, Brian and Julie and Jamie, for all you, and all of the other Humphrey Institute people who have gone into sponsoring and producing this wonderful event. And thank you to all of you good liars who preceded me up here. I want to thank especially Tom Sullivan, who's the provost of the university. Really, and to me, it stands for a host of great administrators who created and sustained this outstanding land-grant institution in which one can make a career of going in and out of the kind of career that I've made and which isn't welcomed everywhere. So thank you, Tom. A word first about my career and then about the cancer. It's true, I've bounced back and forth. And I was going to tell the same story that one of you already told about, who told that story about how when I got tired of the committee meetings and the intrigue over here, I could just leave and go over to the Capitol. Oh, Bob did, yeah, so he stole my best line. Well, government exists, first of all, to protect us from one another. James Madison, my model, said that if we were angels, we wouldn't need government. But he said we're not angels, so we need precautions, was the word that he used. We need devices, we need constraints, we need disciplines. We need to build into our government and our society ways that orient us to behave in ways that accomplish public purposes. For Madison and for me, the first of these precautions is competition, because along with him and Augustine and the Protestant reformers and Reinhold Niebuhr and many others, I think there is a touch of original sin in each of us. It doesn't dominate us necessarily, but there's a touch of it. And it's romantic. It's a romance of my political party to just simply hope that people will do the right thing if they get enough money. That book was entitled Money and Good Intentions Are Not Enough. They're not enough. They're necessary right now. And as Lori mentioned yesterday, I think right now we need a lot more of it in government's hands than in ours. Well, for Madison, the first of these precautions is competition, setting interests against interests, as in elections and in markets. Policymaking is increasingly understood, I think, appropriately, to be designing these institutions that keep us from harming one another, that put a check on our less noble sides. But my contribution, such as it is to the study and practice of public policy, has to do with the fact that competition and private interests aren't the only way that private behavior can be consistently channeled to public good by government. We're not only individuals and individualistic, we're associative and communitarian. We're both. To be American is to be both, which we need to be reminded, especially at this time, this time when, to my mind, Reagan runs supreme, as people think that he's passé. He's not. He's the anti-governmental ideas of Ronald Reagan are going to take another generation to overcome. We are communitarians. We are a community as well as a collection of individuals. Here's an illustration. I was campaigning one day in South Minneapolis in my district and met a woman who told me her family's story, which was that she and her husband had several children, one of whom had severe mental retardation. And at the time, the child was living in the state hospital. And someone from the state came, from Ann and Ed's department, this was before either of them was commissioner, someone from their department came over and said they had a new little experimental program under which people in their situation could, if they want, receive a subsidy from the state, and the state would then give the subsidy to them. They could bring their child home. They weren't forced to do so. That is, the state would still meet its responsibility if they just figured that they could not meet the responsibility. The state would meet its responsibility and take care of this child. But if they wanted to bring the child home, they could do so. So the woman said, they talked it over, and they said, okay, we'll do it. The state gave them, it was only a couple $100 a month. But they put a helmet on the child's head, they bought a fence around the yard. They sometimes just use the money to pay someone to come in for the weekend because it's such a burden. Someone to come in for the weekend to care for the child. But here's what's happened there. A decent society, through its government, has seen to it that a responsibility has been met, not itself, not by government itself, but by a community. The family is a community. The community is meeting its responsibility, and the family is recognized as not having this duty and this burden alone, but jointly with the rest of us. But it's not that government is doing the service, it's just funding the service. Everyone's better off. I passed a number of pieces of legislation that have that same intellectual underpinning. One of my favorites was the Higher Education Aid Program for the state, which goes back now 25 years. It was a year, as so many are, where we needed money. We raised tuition, which cut the amount of money appropriation then that we needed to make. We raised tuition. Then we turned around and put that money into aid exclusively for low and middle income students. Well, enough aid went to them so that their net tuition was lower than it would have been had they simply had to pay the raised tuition. Here again, people, residents, citizens, students had an opportunity to choose in a competition of a sort where they were going to go to college. The state was meeting its responsibility, not only to students in general, not merely to students in general, but especially to the students who were poor and middle income. We need to do it again. We need to jack it up again. We need to raise tuition again, unfortunately, folks, and take the money and put it in the hands of the people who need it the most, who can then choose the community in which they'll flourish. As I say, that's the kind of legislation that I've tried to accomplish when I was over there, and that I've written about over here. For most of us, the only communities that can hold our ultimate commitments, though, our ultimate respect and attachments, and give us ultimate sustenance, are family and religion. My cancer has recurred. It can be treated, but not cured, and I will die in a few weeks or months. It's my great good fortune not to be dying alone. I'll die in your embrace, wrapped in the love of family and friends, and sustained by membership in the church, sustained by this community in my private life that I think has social responsibilities that government needs to not only respect but participate in, as I've just tried to say. I'm a fortunate person who's had a career of at least trying to seek and accomplish the public good, and to do so with friends and colleagues I admire and love, and immersed in a wonderful family. My greatest regret is the abandonment of Shelley and the children and grandchildren. This is harder for her than it is for me, and I admonish you to cherish her and my children and children-in-law and grandchildren. Each of us lives under a sentence of death, but I'm blessed to know roughly when mine's going to be carried out. This is a marvelous situation. I'm free of the usual inhibitions and not shy about telling you not only thank you for being here and for being part of my life, not only thank you for coming, but I love you. And I love you saying that back to me as you've been doing tonight. It's wonderful. I love you.
I really didn't have anything prepared to say, except that it's been a wonderful privilege for me to be married to this wonderful man for 47 and a half years yesterday. Our kids gave us a wedding anniversary cake yesterday in celebration at the hospital, which was such a lovely treat. We won't make it to 50, but we can make it to 47 and a half. And it has been just a wonderful 47 and a half years for me. And I also want to thank the Humphrey for doing this wonderful event for people to be able to come and tell us that they love John and appreciate what he's done. Thank you, Brian, for seeing the opportunity and making this happen while we still had the time. And thank you also for Julie Lund and Jamie Prue and Lorna Schmidt. I know they put a lot of work into making this all happen. It's just a lovely, lovely event. Thank you all for coming.
Well, I also want to thank the people that helped us. They're all mostly up there, Camille Gage, Margaret, Michelle, all of them. This has been a wonderful event. It was done, as you can imagine, fairly quickly. What John Brandl has just shown us is all of the qualities that make him such a wonderful person: his intellect, his concern for his community and his state, his love for all of you, and I think equally importantly, his courage. He's demonstrated all of these qualities tonight. And John, all I can say is, if I can speak for everyone in this room, we love you. Best of luck.